Welcome to this fourth session of our survey of the Old Testament. Previous sessions have emphasized the significance of the Old Testament for the church and for individual believers today. It is and it continues to be the Word of God. It comes to us with divine authority. Through it, God speaks and he makes himself known. And that's why we read it and why we seek to understand it better. The purpose of this session is to look at the different kinds of writing that we find in the Old Testament and to say something about how the kind of writing, the kind of text that it is, makes a difference to the way we read and understand it. Now, we are familiar with different kinds of writing. We can generally tell the difference between, for example, a fairy story, a newspaper report, minutes of a meeting, a formal letter, or a text message, to name but a few. Though with the increase in fake news and conspiracy theories, differences between fact and fantasy are being eroded. But frequently too, the language and the format of the writing helps us to make that distinction. Sometimes particular formulae are used. A letter may begin, "Dear so-and-so," or if it's more formal, "To whom it may concern." Fairy stories might begin, "Once upon a time," and end, "And they all lived happily ever after." That sets the scene and the context. And we treat those different kinds of writing differently, and we respond to them differently. The Old Testament is a book with a variety of authors. It was written over a period of around 1,000 years, and it contains several different styles. I'm going to look at these using the following 6 headings. First, there is law or legal texts. These are mainly found in the Pentateuch, though parts of the prophetic books also use imagery drawn from the law courts. Then there is poetry. Perhaps the best known example of poetry is the Psalms, though much of the prophetic books, as well as of several others, are written in poetic form. And that shows that these are not clear divisions. The styles of writing often overlap. Third, we have narrative or storytelling. This makes up a very substantial part of the Old Testament. It includes historical texts, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, but it's found in many other books too. Another category is wisdom. The main books here are Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. Fifth, there is prophecy. And finally, we have apocalyptic. Now, this is often included with prophecy, though I think there are some important differences. In the Old Testament, this is found mainly in the second part of the book of Daniel. And of course, in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation. Now, let me say that, as with everything else in these sessions, this is a survey. There is much more to say about all of the things that we're looking at. And my aim here is just to give an overview of the main points. Let's begin with the law. At the heart of the Old Testament are the 10 Commandments. They give us a kind of summary which is spelled out in more detail in the chapters that follow, Exodus 21:2 through to 23:33. This passage, this section, is sometimes called the Book of the Covenant or the Covenant Code. And it emphasizes the close link between being in covenant relationship with God, which is set out in Exodus 19, and obedience to God's law. Another important legal text is Leviticus 17-26, which is sometimes called the Holiness Code, and it includes the very key principle, "Be holy, because I, the Lord, your God, am holy." A principle that is also repeated by Peter in his first letter in the New Testament. Deuteronomy 12-26 contains further regulations that we find nowhere else, including the conduct of wars and regulations about courts and judges and divorce and remarriage. Now, there are some similarities between Old Testament laws and those found in much earlier ancient Near Eastern law codes, such as the law code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a king in Mesopotamia in the 18th century BC. There is a stele showing Hammurabi receiving the law code with the text below it. This includes a variation of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I suppose we shouldn't really be surprised where there are these similarities. These legal codes were intended to enable people to live peacefully together within society. And there are bound to be things that were necessary to allow any society to function. There is, though, a big difference. In Hammurabi's code, the eye for an eye rule didn't apply if someone from the upper class injured someone from the lower class. In that case, they just needed to pay compensation. In the Old Testament, the same law applies equally to everyone. Now, the prophets also use legal language. In some, God brings a case against the people because they have broken the covenant. We see this, for example, in Isaiah 1, 2, and 3, Jeremiah 2, 4 to 3, Hosea 4, 1 to 3, Micah 6, 1 to 8. In Isaiah 40 to 55, God calls false gods into a courtroom to make the case that they are gods. And he calls Israel as witnesses to what he has done in their history, for example, and that he is the true God. And there are some references noted there. Now, law in the Old Testament is sometimes regarded as legalistic, and therefore it's not relevant to a faith based on God's grace revealed through Christ. However, in the Old Testament, the law was seen as something positive. We look, for example, at Psalm 19, verses 7 to 11. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The decrees of the Lord are firm, and all of them are righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the honeycomb. By them your servant is warned. In keeping them, there is great reward. The law was a means by which God's people could know what God required of them, and so could work out their covenant faith in relation to God and to each other. And one of the roles of the Spirit is to help people keep God's law. We see that, for example, in Ezekiel 36, verses 26 to 28. Obedience to the law is also part of the new covenant when it will be written on human hearts, so giving a new ability to obey. Now, applying legal passages to the church is not easy. One common suggestion is to argue that the sacrificial and ceremonial laws, the food laws, and all of these other laws, laws about cleansing from impurities and festivals and so on, is no longer relevant, but that the moral law continues to have a place. That, though, seems a little arbitrary. Why should one set of laws be valid and others not? And it's not clear that the Old Testament itself makes a clear distinction between these things. Leviticus 17 to 26 includes moral law alongside instructions about festivals. And the first part of the book, which focuses more on sacrifices and ceremonial cleansing, also has the same expression, be holy, for I am holy. It seems better to look at the principles underlying all the laws, including laws about sacrifices and ceremonies, and look at ways of applying those principles in our very different contexts. We've already looked at that in relation to sacrifices. Secondly, let's look at reading poetry. A significant part of the Old Testament is written as poetry. This can usually be distinguished from prose by the amount of white space in modern translations. You can see the difference, for example, between these passages, one straightforward narrative, the other written as poetry. Best known among poems in the Old Testament, as we've said, is the book of Psalms, which contains hymns and prayers covering a wide range of situations, including praise and thanksgiving and laments or complaints by individuals and by the community, asking God why things are going wrong and praying for help. Prophecy and wisdom literature are also often written as poetry. Now, there are three key features of Hebrew poetry. One is parallelism. Frequently, lines of poetry will say the same thing, but using different words. So, for example, Psalm 6 verse 1 reads, "O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath." Here, rebuke in the first part of the line and discipline in the second are roughly equivalent, and so are anger and wrath. A variation of this is when the two lines complement each other. So in Psalm 95 verse 4, we have the following: "In his hands are the depths of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to him." Now here, "in his hand" corresponds to belongs to him. The depth of the earth, though, and the mountain peaks are opposites. And in this case, the parts of the verse are complementary. They emphasize that God is in control of the heights and of the depths, but of course, also everything in between. Everything belongs to him. The next verse says pretty much the same thing. "The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land." The sea, the land, everything belongs to God. Now, poetry is also written using as few words as possible. This means that words are sometimes omitted, and while that makes poetry attractive to read, we need to be careful about interpretation. And finally, poetry uses a great deal of imagery. It may be helpful to see how poetry differs from narrative by looking at how each is used to describe Israel's crossing of the Red Sea. In Exodus 14, 23 to 28, that is described in narrative form. And then in chapter 15, verses 1 to 12, which is a song, it is written as poetry. And you note, for example, the poetic imagery in the second of those. The Egyptians were hurled into the sea. They sank to the depths like a stone. God consumed them like stubble. It talks about the blast of your nostrils. In the narrative account, it talks more straightforwardly about the wind blowing and about the water covering them. Elsewhere, we're told that the trees and rivers clap their hands and the mountains sing for joy, that the mountains skipped like rams, the hills like lambs. Now, clearly, these texts are not intended to be interpreted literally. What they mean in terms of celebration is clear enough, but they are not literal. And the non-literal interpretation of biblical texts is an important issue for the study of the Old Testament. And then we come to reading narrative. Around 1/3 of the Old Testament is narrative or story. One major section is Genesis through to 2 Kings, sometimes described as the primary history. Now, this was composed over a long period of time. It contains many shorter narratives, but it's presented as a single narrative. Another major section is Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, sometimes referred to as the chronistic history. The prophetic books also contain some narrative. Jonah, for example, is mainly narrative, and Jeremiah includes narrative describing episodes in the life of the prophet. Esther and the first part of Daniel are also written as narrative. Now, key features of Old Testament narrative include characters, the people who appear in the story. Now, we're rarely given much detail about the characters, usually only as much as we need to understand what is happening. So in 2 Samuel 11:2, Bathsheba is described as very beautiful, and that explains David's attraction to her. But we know very little else, just enough to make the story work. We may also hear about characters' thoughts and feelings, and in this way, they are presented as real people, sometimes with complex personalities. Narrative also includes a plot or storyline, and crucially, there is a narrator who effectively tells us the story. Another feature of narrative is the use of carefully chosen words. This is not always clear in English translations. So, for example, in Genesis 2:25, the last verse of chapter 2, in that verse, we're told that the man and women were naked. Now, that word in Hebrew, arom, looks and sounds very similar to the word for crafty, arum, which is used to describe the serpent in the next verse in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. And that provides a link between the two passages. Now, arum may also mean clever, and there may be a subtle irony here. Adam and Eve ate the fruit, hoping to be arum, wise, but instead they discovered that they were arom, naked. It wasn't the outcome they hoped for. Now, one of the important questions about biblical narrative is how historically accurate is it? Now, because the Bible is God's word, we take it to be true. And that generally means we regard those sections that appear to be written as history as literally true. However, whilst in our context, historical narrative is expected to contain reliable and, where possible, verifiable factual material, although, as I've said, in these days with fake news, we hear about alternative facts. But that's the way it's supposed to be. Reliable and, where possible, verifiable facts. It was different for the Old Testament writers. And this is an important point, so I'm going to spend a few minutes on it. As I've said before, history in the Old Testament is an important part of divine revelation. God is known through what he does. And because history is revelation, the meaning of an event is more important than the accurate recording of the event itself. Now, that doesn't mean the writers made things up. I'm not suggesting that for a moment. But they told the story in such a way as to make the meaning clear. That was the way ancient history writing worked. Now, I believe that scripture is inspired by God. It is God-breathed. But as I've already said, it was written by human beings, and divine inspiration did not turn ancient history writers into modern history writers. That means they have some freedom in how they recount the story, and they may not write according to the conventions of modern history writers. Let me give a few examples of that, two from the New Testament and one from the Old Testament. If we look at John's Gospel, he tells the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the same story as the other gospel writers, but sometimes in a different way, in order to highlight the theological significance of what is happening. Take the story of Jesus cleansing the temple. Matthew, Mark, and Luke place that not long before Jesus was arrested and killed. And that seems the most likely time. It was one of the things that stirred up hostility towards Jesus. John, though, puts it at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Why? Well, probably to emphasize the change that Jesus had come to bring, challenging corruption and the misuse of the temple. The theological significance of the event takes priority over its chronological accuracy. At the end of his life, the other gospel writers describe Jesus celebrating the Passover with his disciples. John, though, talks about Jesus being crucified on the day of preparation, which is when the Passover lambs would have been sacrificed in the temple. Now, that emphasizes the link between Jesus and the Passover lamb. Now, I know people try to harmonize these accounts, but it makes more sense to recognize that they represent different ways of reporting history. They didn't get the facts wrong. It was just a different way of doing things. The third example is from the Old Testament. In Genesis 14, we have the story of fighting between the armies of two groups of kings. One group included the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. And when that group was defeated, Abraham's nephew Lot, who was living in Sodom, was taken captive. Now that brought Abraham into the picture, and he set off with his men to rescue Lot. After his success, we're told that Melchizedek, king of Salem, which is probably a reference to Jerusalem, came out to meet him. We're also told that he was a priest of God Most High in verse 18. At that time, though, God Most High could refer both to God, but it was also a title given to a Canaanite god, and Salem was, on the face of it, a Canaanite city. So there might be some doubt as to whether this was the same God that was worshipped by Abraham. But the narrator goes on to make the position clear. First, he reports Melchizedek's words, "Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth." And then he reports Abraham's words, "I have sworn an oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth." You'll see there that the words are the same. And by repeating the words exactly, the narrator is emphasizing that the God worshipped by Melchizedek is the same God that is worshipped by Abraham. Now, an important question here is, are those the exact words that Melchizedek and Abraham spoke? Now, in my view, they probably said something very like that. But it seems also likely that the narrator has adjusted them to give this repetition and to make the theological point. Now, there is something else here. The Lord is the name of God that was only revealed much later to Moses, the name Yahweh in Exodus 3:15 and Exodus 6:2 and 3. And it seems likely that it wouldn't have been used by Abraham. The narrator, though, is making another important point. Not only do Abraham and Melchizedek worship the same God, but the God they worship is the same God, Yahweh, who is worshipped by the people who first read this story. Now, there are several other references to Yahweh in Genesis before we get to the revelation to Moses, and they make the same point. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the same God that the people now know as Yahweh. Now, let me say again, these stories are not made up. The storytellers may have had some freedom in how they told them, but what they write has a solid basis in history. In my view, there really was an Abraham and a Melchizedek who met under these circumstances and probably said something similar to what is reported. But the precise words have been changed to make the meaning of that encounter and its relevance to future generations clearer. Now, there are some narratives that may be less historical. The books of Jonah and Esther, for example, include elements that may suggest that they're not intended to be read as history, such as exaggeration, humor, coincidence, though others, of course, argue that they are historical. Let me say, though, that even if they are not historical, they are no less inspired by the Spirit. The message of Jesus' parables in the New Testament is real, even if the historical details of the stories are not. And the same is true for these sections of the Old Testament. Now, there's a great deal more to say about Old Testament narrative, and I've included more information and included further examples in an extra session, which will follow this one, reading Old Testament narrative. The next section in the Old Testament is wisdom. The books are usually associated with wisdom are Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. Now, wisdom in the Old Testament is associated with understanding the way the world works. And that is at the heart, for example, of the book of Proverbs, which includes many short, pithy sayings that are intended to give people guidance on how to conduct their lives. Job and Ecclesiastes take that a little further, and they talk about some of life's big questions. Innocent suffering in Job, the meaning of life in Ecclesiastes. And it's possible to see a tension here. Proverbs seems to suggest answers to life's problems. Do this and certain things will happen as a result. And those are good general rules. But life isn't always as fair and as fulfilling as that may suggest. And Job and Ecclesiastes look at situations where the rules don't seem to work, and they offer a wider perspective on life. Especially Job, but also Ecclesiastes, challenge the popular idea that human suffering must be a result of sin, and that righteousness leads to prosperity and blessing. This is sometimes called the law of retribution. Now, it's also important to see these texts against a theological background in which there is no developed understanding of life after death. So success and fulfillment are limited to what may be achieved in this life. And we've already seen something of that in relation to the book of Job. Another key type of literature in the Old Testament is prophecy. Old Testament prophets were mediators. They brought direct communication from God to the people. There's a helpful description of this in Exodus 7:1-2. The Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. You are to say everything that I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country." Prophets were, for the most part, preachers, and their task was to speak to their contemporaries. Often it was to bring challenge or to bring reassurance. They wanted to influence and to shape the nation's history according to God's will. Now, of course, it's true that prophets did talk about the future, though in most cases that was in order to highlight the importance of obedience and a right response to God in the present. And this means that prophecy was not primarily intended for some future generation. Now, that's not to say it's not relevant to future generations. We believe it is. But crucially, it must also be relevant and have significance for its first audience. It would be strange to preach a sermon that meant nothing to the congregation at the time, but would be relevant to another congregation in a few years or a few hundred years. And we need to avoid doing the same thing with Old Testament prophecy. Even where a prophecy does point forward, for example, to Jesus, we need also to ask what it may have meant to those who first heard it. What was the significance of the prophet's words for the people of their day? And we need to be very cautious if we interpret a prophetic text in a way that would not have made sense to its original audience. And the last section is apocalyptic. Apocalyptic, like some parts of prophecy, focuses on the future. It is often revealed by supernatural beings, and it points to the final salvation of God's people in a coming kingdom, often as part of a radically different world order. In the Old Testament, the second half of the book of Daniel comes broadly into this category, and there are a number of other similar writings outside the Old Testament. Apocalyptic is often associated with prophecy, and some of the imagery in prophetic books such as Ezekiel and Zechariah may have influenced later apocalyptic writers, though there are also several differences. One difference is the purpose of the message. Prophets, as we've seen, had a message for the present generation. They wanted to make a difference to their world. Apocalyptic writers are not too interested in the present. There is a sense in which they despair of the present world order and they focus on the world to come. Now that is relevant. It points to a better world and it inspires hope. But it's not interested in changing the present in the way the prophets are. Apocalyptic also contains elaborate symbolism and imagery. Now that can make texts difficult to understand, and because though the symbols would have meant something to those who first heard or read the words, they are often unfamiliar to us. And there is a danger of trying to interpret apocalyptic language too literally. Some have read Daniel and Revelation, and they've arrived at a blueprint of the end of the world. That's not what these books are for. They do point to God's future kingdom, but the aim is to encourage God's people in the present. And the language and the imagery would have been understood by those who first heard the message. Visions of the future are given to emphasize the certainty of the coming of God's kingdom and the vindication of his people, not to give a detailed scheme of how it will all happen. Now, some of this I appreciate is a little controversial. I'll say a bit more about some aspects of these things when we look at the individual books. For the moment, though, thanks again for listening, and I'll see you again soon.